Next to me is James Hackney, the Dean of the School of Law. So he's going to say a few words. After that, we'll introduce our keynote speaker. So James, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, David. I'm pleased that we are convening today to discuss the intersection between law, business, and social justice. A special thanks to Tom Tyler for joining us as keynote speaker. Also thanks to our panelists who represent the interdisciplinary focus of our faculty and the combining of efforts between the School of Law and the DeMoore McKim School of Business. Early on in conversations with David DeCremer, we discussed the important role that behavioral approaches to law and business could serve in thinking about social justice issues. That conversation led to this collaboration and the invitation to Tom, which I hope will be the beginning of much more to come. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, James. Okay, a few words about why we're doing this is, if you've considered questions about, if you consider questions about why do people obey the law, why is it that people are willing to accept unfavorable outcomes if they're treated fairly? These are all questions that have to do with compliance. Compliance, the willingness to collaborate with the social system, to be willing to follow social rules and laws. And as all of you know, because most of you are studying justice one way or another, we all know that real compliance doesn't depend on dictatorship or putting the whip on people, punishing people, but more so on how we treat them, how we respect people, how they see the process. And this is what we refer to quite often, both in social justice and in the law literature, as procedural justice issues. Is the process fair? Do you feel respected? Do you feel included? So many of our issues when it comes down to compliance, do people obey the law? And our keynote speaker wrote an amazing book about it in 1990, Why People Obey the Law, which paved the path of the whole behavioral approaches to social justice. There you will see that both business and I think the way we implement our laws, the way we talk about our laws and frame the laws, it's extremely important that we have respectful messages with it and people feel that inclusion. And that is something that we need to address more simply than an instrumental point of view, where we look at outcomes. So I learned these lessons early in my career as a social and organizational justice scholar when I met our keynote speaker, Tom Tyler, 26 years ago. So we already know each other for 26 years. And we worked together a lot on projects, on mainly procedural justice and trust projects. When I was visiting him early this century at New York University, where he was a university professor. In fact, my first work day was 9/11, so we never forget that. That was a good bonding experience as well. But I've learned so much there, and also at that time, some of you may still remember, some of you are maybe too young, but at that time, NYPD had on their cars professionalism, respect, dignity, and that was based on what Tom was doing at that time. So it was very impactful and it made a big impression on me as a scholar. And you see, I ended up in a business school, but maybe, like James said, I could have been in the law school as well if I would have taken another turn, but it made me already very much aware of issues of business, respect, and law. They come together. So Tom Tyler is the Macklin Fleming Professor of Law and Professor of Psychology at Yale Law School. He's also the founding director of the Justice Collaboratory, which has been gaining a lot of reputation in the last few years, especially with their impact on theorizing and having the impact on society. He's also a professor, a courtesy appointment at the Yale School of Management. So I think he's best placed, especially in our state, but I think in the country, to be honest, but of course I'm biased, to talk about the interplay between law and business from a behavioral point of view. Now, like I said, he's published many books, including Why People Cooperate, Legitimacy in Criminal Justice, Trust in the Law, and Why People Obey the Law, and published, I would almost say, trillions of academic papers. He's an amazing scholar, And that has also been demonstrated, his research has been awarded the Harry Kelvin Prize for paradigm-shifting scholarship in the study of law and society by the Law and Society Association. The International Society for Justice Research gave him the Lifetime Achievement Award, and only last year he was awarded the Stockholm Prize in Criminology, which is the world's highest honor in the field of criminology, for pioneering and advancing research on legitimacy, which he will be talking about, I assume, today, and procedural justice to increase trust in policing. So if you really want to learn how to be impactful as a scholar, which our provost really emphasizes, he wants to see impact, I think Tom is an excellent example. Psychologist, management, business school, the law school, and any area related to this refers to his work. So I think that's the example to pursue. So please give him a warm welcome, because Tom will be talking today about leveraging justice to enhance leadership in law and business. Tom, the floor is yours. So I think everything works.
Well, I thank David for that very kind introduction. I think you probably now are all in the last year getting the sense of David's unending energy and creativity. I have been the beneficiary of working with him, as he said, for a long time, and many of the ideas that I'll talk about at the end of the day, it's hard to say whose ideas are these. It's a field, it's a group. But I think it has, as he said, a lot to say about the way that, from my point of view, law, management are connected. Oh, and I need slides here. Is it? Yeah, the presentation should be right there. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so not a good beginning to a talk that's supposed to show I know about technology, but I'll bounce back. Okay. So, to me, the basic point is that we see law schools, we see management schools, we see schools of public policy, separate journals, separate classes. But to me, what's important from a behavioral point of view is that they all share very common concerns. And one particular recognition through all these fields is that we need authority structures to achieve our goals. And in law, we talk a lot about regulation, managing rule following. In governance, we talk about building viable societies. In business or management, we talk about creating structures that promote profitability. Okay, but my argument will be that all of these different concerns can be seen as very similar in the sense that we can have one model that can help us to understand what motivates these behaviors, and that model basically is a common model of justice. Well, so if we just started without a justice frame, we would probably say that people's behavior is motivated by their expected utilities, what they think they have to gain and lose by the things they do in organizations. I think that social psychology has made a very valuable contribution by showing that actually, when they're dealing with authorities and institutions, people are powerfully affected by their sense of justice, distinct from what they might gain or lose in a particular setting. Also, they have distinct ideas about what a just procedure is and again, that are distinct from winning or losing, or even getting what you deserve. Now, most people start out when they hear a statement like that by asking, could that really work? Is that really possible, a viable system of authority based upon justice? And as an empiricist, I'm going to argue, and then I'm going to show you that this model is well supported by evidence, even if it goes against people's intuitions or economic theories. All right, so I'm going to make two arguments. The first argument is that there is a model based upon procedural justice in particular, the justice of the procedures used to reach decisions, that is desirable in all of these fields, law, governance, and business. And second, that thinking about authority in this way is really helpful to us because we see both law and management going through an unending series of changes in forms, procedures, and we need a way to try to think about, are those good or bad? So think about in law, the blizzard of alternative forms of conflict management. We have now remote interactions, we have algorithmic procedures, we have artificial intelligence, and even recently now we have chatbots. Procedural justice gives us a way to think about all of these different forms within one common framework and to decide if we think they might be good or they might be bad. Okay, well, what's new about this? In both law and management, the common approach is to rely on incentives and sanctions to gain desirable behavior. And one of the consequences of this is authorities focus their concern on the kinds of behavior that could be responsive to that kind of an approach, and in particular, specified in advance and observable. So we tend to see a focus on rule compliance and in-role behavior. Now, the advantage of a procedural justice approach is that it will motivate both compliance and in-role behavior as well as a sanction or incentive-based system, but it's much better at motivating things that increasingly we recognize are as or more desirable. Willing deference to authority, willing cooperation with communities or organizations, and active engagement in collectivities. So, to summarize, a distinct model of authority based upon the motivating power of justice, recognizing that we want more than simple rule-related behavior or in-role behavior. Now, I would emphasize in saying all of this, I'm not going to say to you that procedural justice is the only thing that people care about. They don't care if they win or lose. They don't care how much they get paid. No, that's not true. But what is true is that this is consistently a strong independent influence on what people do. And therefore, it is a basis for theories both of law and management about how to exercise authority to get what we want in communities and organizations. Okay, well, again, does it work? I'll give you some examples. As an empiricist, of course, I'm interested in evidence to support this, and as skeptics, you might like to see some evidence. Okay, let's consider some personal contacts that people have. First, law, a study of people going to court, and then I'll talk about a management example. Well, if you were a person going to court, say you went to small claims court, what would determine how you felt and whether you accepted the decision by an authority? Would it be that you win? Would it be that you get the outcome you think is fair, that you deserve? Or would it be that you think that the decisions that were made by the mediator or the judge were made in fair ways, in other words, fair procedures? This is a study of people who go to court in California, and you can see that the three factors that I talked about, they're no longer here. The way these figures are presented. This is a regression equation with these three independent variables predicting a dependent variable or another dependent variable. And these are the strength of the independent role of each of these factors in shaping this outcome. So why will people defer to a decision by a mediator or a judge? Defer means I willingly accept it, I'm not going to appeal, I'm not angry, I'm going to go along with it. And you can see the overwhelming role of thinking that the procedure was fair, separate from the outcomes. Also trusting the authority, the same overwhelming role. And if we consider why are you there in the first place? You could be there because you bring your problem to court, or you could be there because you have to come, you're a defendant, doesn't matter. Same point in both cases. So if we're asking, how do you get deference with a legal authority, the answer would be an important thing to do is to use a procedure that is fair, that's experienced as fair by the people involved. Well, what about management? Here I'm going to give an example from a private corporation. This corporation had an internal ethics reporting system. So if you had a complaint, you could send it into an internal ethics board and they would do something. And we have the same question. Why will you accept what they do? And in particular, in their case, they were concerned that this would not end up on the New York Times front page. So would you accept it? You're not going outside the company. This is okay with you. And again, you see in this very different situation the same thing. Whether people got a fair process is more important to them than what happened concerning their complaint. And I think we can use this example to also begin to tell us why we might like procedural justice approaches especially. You come to the board with a complaint. Something unethical is happening in my company. The procedure has a number of positive consequences. You identify more with the company. You are more satisfied with your job. You intend to stay more if they resolve your grievance, your complaint, through a fair procedure. So you're actually building positive engagement in the company through dealing with a complaint, basically. Just give a second example, which is more substantial, but you see the same thing. Here, two banks merge, and the question is, how do people feel about the resulting new bank? And one thing you might consider is, how much did you gain or lose? Benefits, opportunities. The other is, was the process of the merger fair? And again, you can see that an important independent effect, not everything, but an important independent effect is, was the procedure fair? On the merger was good, I identify with the new company, I'm going to stay with the new company. So in other words, it's not just deference to authority, but it's also building identification with engagement in the group. All right. And then just finally to mention government, the Netherlands has an ombudsperson program that's based upon procedural justice. They trained all their InTech people to use procedural justice. What happened? They found dramatic all-round improvements. So 20% cost reduction because so many of the cases were just settled by the initial discussion with the case officer. Citizens were much happier because they felt fairly treated, and employees were much happier because people didn't yell at them as much. So all of these are examples of what's potentially gained by thinking about systems of authority in terms of fair procedures. Okay, so procedural justice is important, not just because it's deference, but also cooperation and engagement. Now, I keep using this word, procedural justice, and once you realize it's important, then you would say, what is it? We have this nice figure we created, which I will explain to you. 4 things are consistently found to matter when people say they did or didn't get fair treatment, procedural justice. Quality of decision-making, are people allowed voice? Is the authority neutral? Quality of treatment, respect, and trust. So let's go through those just briefly. Voice, people want an opportunity, tell their story, give their evidence, state their case before decisions are made. And many grievances come from not feeling you get that opportunity. People want an authority that they can trust, that's neutral, principled, unbiased, evidence-based, consistent across people and cases. Here, the key is to be seen as neutral through transparency and explanation. Respect, people take their status, their standing very seriously. Their concerns should be addressed and taken seriously. They should be treated with dignity, politeness, courtesy, and their rights should be recognized. Then trust. We always find that this is really central to the way people think about their interactions with authorities. They want to feel that the person is sincere, caring, benevolent, has good intentions, they're trying to do the right thing. An inference. How do you know? Well, you see as the person listening to and considering what they say, seeming to take their case seriously, trying to do the right thing. Okay, so those four elements divided into fair decision-making and fair treatment usually define what people mean by getting procedural justice. And they certainly do in the examples I gave you. So in the court example, what is procedural justice defined as by the people? Fair decision-making, fair treatment. Same in the complaint, the ethics complaint situation. Fair decision-making, fair treatment. So the advantage here, again, voluntary deference and willing cooperation coming through attention to these aspects of process. But why does procedural justice work? Obviously, not everyone can get what they want in a group situation, and so there's contention over outcomes, but everyone can get procedural fairness. Everyone can feel that they have a voice. Everyone can feel that their arguments are being listened to and considered, that their needs are being taken seriously. To the degree that people focus on these procedural elements, they focus less on whether they win or lose. And so it's not really about being happy, like, yay, I lost. It's about accepting that you are receiving certain elements that you value in terms of fairness, fair procedures for decision-making and for treatment. All right. And in particular, the idea of relational motives matters here. A lot of what people care about is what their experience with an authority tells them about their status and standing in a group, an organization. And messages about respect, dignity, treatment, being taken seriously, they are ways of affirming or diminishing somebody's identity. So the fairness of treatment aspect of procedural justice really matters a lot because it's intertwined with identity and inclusion, which are separate concerns besides how the decision gets made. So what you can see here is the argument that there is a way to focus on something that everybody can have. And I would like to emphasize, because we're talking about authority, that to me this is an authority system that gains its power because it's responsive to people. It's responsive to the concerns that the people have about what they want in authority. All right. So obviously, not everything is about individual experiences. So what about collectivities. What about, for example, a work organization that's a police department? Has the same characteristics as a corporation. What do we want? Same things. Rule following, deference, cooperation, engagement. Okay, so here's the Chicago Police. Why do they do those things? What you can see is that certainly the quality of work benefits, risks on the job matter, but the procedural justice of the department is centrally implicated, and as we become more and more moving in the direction of voluntary engagement here, working to improve your community, procedural justice takes on a bigger role. Similar, these are combat troops in Iraq. Why do they do their jobs? Procedural justice, extra role action, procedural justice, and the commitment, the intention to stay in this combat zone, very much procedural justice. Okay, what about management? This is the national sample of employees. It has the feature that the supervisor tells us what the employee is doing. So the employee rates the workplace, the supervisor says what they do. And what you can see is that if employees say the procedure in their organization is just, the supervisor says they comply with work rules, they defer, they cooperate, and they are creative in the workplace in trying to improve their organization. I especially want to emphasize this idea of voluntary cooperation, separate study of corporate bankers. Why do they do extra role things? Again, procedural fairness more than outcomes. So you're getting the picture here. All right. Well, what about external constituents? This is an example of the public in relationship to the police. Why does the public do these things? If the public experiences the police as fair, as opposed to issues like they're good at their jobs, I could get arrested, or they follow the law, you can see it doesn't matter much for compliance, but for public cooperation, public engagement in the community, seeing the police as fair is central. So again, you get the idea that the more we move away from rule following to active, willing engagement, the more procedural justice jumps out to us. Right. I've never studied the way customers view companies, but there is a literature here that says the same thing. Customers care if their company is procedurally just. Okay, but communities. So community governance. This is the kind of the new frontier from my point of view. How should we make decisions about land use? And this is a Florida study. Which procedure do you want to use? The decision is not which one will get you to win. It's which one has the attributes of a fair procedure. Where do you want to put the nuclear power plant? Same thing. I'll accept the decision if the procedure that's arrived at is fair. Okay, so again, on this aggregate level, procedural justice is important. And the same issues might matter. You can see this is residents in California, system-level evaluations of the court, in particular, fair treatment of the courts, and then the employee example, national sample evaluating companies, again, procedural justice. And you have one of your own faculty members is doing this work. There we go. Zenu. And I think what his work emphasizes is the degree to which the impact of procedural justice on these different behaviors is going through more than just social exchange. It's going through identity-relevant judgments. In other words, relational kinds of judgments matter. Okay, so can we extend this to a general model? I'll give a couple of examples. One is Obviously, things are changing all the time. One of the big ways that things are changing is that a lot of work now is being done on online platforms. So can we use this model to understand how to deal with that? Content moderation. I'll talk about a study done at Meta where users have their content removed, and the goal is to prevent recidivism, to stop them from doing bad things again. Does it matter if the content removal procedure is experienced as fair? So across 3 different kinds of misconduct, nudity, hate speech, and bullying, if users experience the procedure as fairer, they are more likely not to basically do it again. So procedural justice can be a model for managing content moderation and building self-regulation. Could we enhance this by proactively telling people that the procedures of the organization are fair? So in people's stream, they get messages that basically say, the procedure we use is fair. And so you get these messages in your daily stream, and then eventually you break the rules, and the question is, does it help? And the answer is absolutely yes. So if you've gotten a message, as opposed to no message, that says the rules are fair, you're more likely to think that the takedown system is fair, and you're more likely not to recidivate if you made a mistake. So we can be proactive, and then finally, we can actually try to promote civility. Again, this is my thought about why procedural justice ultimately is good, is it promotes good. It doesn't just stop bad. So this is a study of Nextdoor. And as you probably know, Nextdoor does neighborhood groups. So when a group is formed, the people forming the group are told, here's principles of procedural justice that you should use in your group interactions, like listen to people, things like that, cite evidence. Okay, well, does that help? We can use Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations Dictionary to code the content of these groups, and when we do that, we find that if people are told in advance procedural fairness, they're more positive in the tone of their interactions. People in the groups are then less likely to complain to the vendor compared to the control group. So we're actually using fair procedure to build positive civility. Okay. Same way we can use a procedural justice approach to guide our choices among procedures. So when a problem comes up, how do we want to resolve it? And in particular, we can think of this in terms of automated procedures. So here's a situation where on Nextdoor, people do report a problem to the vendor. How are we going to handle the problem? There's 4 ways it could be handled: algorithm, a vendor employee, or the neighbors could decide what to do. Interestingly, both the person who's being reported on and the reporter think algorithms are the least fair way to resolve this dispute, although they don't agree on what's the most fair way. Well, why is procedural justice good here? If you are the reporter, we want you to feel good about what we did, and so you will make future reports and you will stay engaged in the site. And procedural justice drives those things. If you're the person who is reported against, we don't want you to do it again. And so people who see the process as fair are less likely to do it again, but they're also more likely to be engaged in the site in the future because it was handled fairly. So in other words, procedural justice can help us achieve all of our goals at the same time. All right, so conclusion. I know I've gone through a lot of different pieces of evidence. I've written a lot of papers, as David said, and I'll send the slightest encouragement, I'll send you a boatload of papers. But I'm trying to summarize the general thrust of things with this. We can use this idea that people care about justice to help us to design authority systems, and it seems to work in law, in management, and in governance. It's a universal approach. And in particular, it's valuable to us because we get willing deference and voluntary cooperation and engagement. So in law, with the rational actor model guiding us, we would focus on compliance because that's what we could manage with rational actor model. But here, we can focus on a broader set of goals. And a particularly important goal to me is improving communities. The police are always saying you can't arrest your way out of crime. You need to build the community. So we're building community engagement with this model. Governance, I think I don't have to talk about ideology and the need to bridge across ideology. Lots of evidence that procedural justice can do that. In business, I think it's obvious to all of you in management that we don't just want people to do their jobs. We want them to do extra things. That's why the whole idea of extra role behavior developed. And beyond that, to me, we want creative engagement. We want people to put their minds into their work, which is something you cannot make them do. But if they're inspired, they will do it. And so maybe just one final conclusion. David said I'd talk about legitimacy, which I obviously didn't do. But the point is that procedural justice is mediated by people feeling that the organization is legitimate and they ought to defer to it, and by trust in management. Both of those are centrally consequent to thinking that fair procedures are being used in an organization. So thank you.
I'm just grabbing a mic, and I'll bring questions around. This is
Good morning, Sonia Roland from the School of Law, and I'm actually on sabbatical at the business school, so an example of those collaborations. So my question is, this is obviously a powerful model. You've shown all the evidence. I think even more powerful because intuitively we can recognize the truth of all the evidence that you have presented. And so my question is, what's holding us back, right? What's in the way of this happening on a grand scale everywhere all the time? Thank you.
Well, I think that the command and control model is very comforting to authorities because they have all the resources and they can make all the decisions. And so there's a risk involved here. The risk is if you basically give up that and you're more responsive to communities and listening to people and letting them be involved in a real way, you would lose control. And that's why I think all this evidence is important, because we need to convince people that actually you wouldn't lose control so much as you would gain a lot. Like with the police, the police don't like, well, I wouldn't be in command. And so we say, well, really smart policing is recognizing that you'll get what you want in this situation. That's what's important, not that you feel in command, but that you get the behaviors that you want. And so I think that's the strategy, but as you said, it's threatening to people not to have control, and so you have to be convinced it's worth the risk.
Okay, hi. So I'm Margaret Wu, I'm at the law school, and I'm a big admirer of your work. I teach civil procedure, and so of course, I'm a big proponent of procedural justice. But my question is, I'm kind of stuck between which we should focus on. right? I mean, it's a little bit like a chicken and egg scenario. Is it more that we should focus on building up trust and legitimacy, because then it will lead to perceptions of fair procedure, or is it really fair procedure that leads to greater trust and legitimacy?
Well, I don't think you really have to choose, because we see both things. We see a direct connection between was the process fair, is the organization making decisions treating but then also, if we put a model of cognitions in the middle, we see that some of that's going through legitimacy as opposed to directly. You know, so well, I think what I would do is I would focus on trying to create the fairest procedures I could create, and would think that that would both build legitimacy and motivate behavior, and that you wouldn't have to choose. Yeah, I don't think you necessarily have to choose, because the same things you're going to do to build a sense of fair procedure are going to build legitimacy, motivate compliance, motivate deference, accelerate cooperation, I would say. You know, what we do find is that with people who have a marginal relationship to the organization, like with the state, with people who don't trust the state, basically, they develop a personal connection between the procedural justice of the people they deal with and what they're going to do. So for them, legitimacy is irrelevant to this. The police treat me, these police officers treat me fairly, so I will accept them.
Hello, hi. I was wondering, how do you get the conversation started, and who get these conversations started in your organization to see if you are practicing this model? What would be your advice?
So that's a great question. I think that organizations have been responsive to the fact that people at the bottom, whether it's members of the community or employees, are pushing back against what they experience to be unfair work conditions or unfair conditions in their community. So I think working with those groups to try to express their concerns upward to management is a good start. Because in my experience, the people who are actually like in the environment where they're experiencing unfairness are the ones who actually really know how disturbing that is. And people up at the top, it's much more abstract to them. And so I think they need to see pressure coming. They need to see, like the studies that show that customers actually care if a company is viewed as treating its employees fairly. That's pressure on management coming from a recognition that there's a harm to them.
Sheila Puffer from the business school. Good morning.
Good morning.
In this age of misinformation, disinformation, and the like, the whole question of what is fair may be the issue, a redefinition of that. Bob, how do you see the evolution of what fairness means in this day and age, with the accessibility of social media for disseminating misinformation, and also if you could address AI as part of the mix, please.
Well, AI may be a big challenge, but let me think about what you're saying. We have found that these principles of procedural justice seem to be more or less universal, in that, like if you go across income levels, across gender, across racial groups, and more recently across ideology, people tend to look at these principles and use them to decide if something is fair or not fair. So I, in particular, lately have been studying whether polarization, ideological polarization, undermines this. And the answer is no, not really. I mean, liberals and conservatives may agree about a lot of things and disagree about a lot of things, but they all accept certain definitions of what makes a procedure fair or unfair. So I think the point is to emphasize that a procedure, whether it's something you're in personally or something that's more organization level, has these elements of fairness, highlight fairness. So, for example, in the case of what's going on now with election denial, if you look at people who are more ideological extremes on political ideology, they still focus a lot on these four elements in trying to decide whether an election was fair or not fair. So I think there's hope. And AI, that's really a big problem, isn't it? I'm not sure what I think about that. Okay.
Associate Dean of the Business School. What is the next step here in terms of wanting to get people to get to, let's say, management and themselves being proponents of procedural justice? So in this case, does experiencing fair procedures also get people, when they get in positions of power, to basically amplify this behavior?
Well, hopefully, what we're seeing here at Northeastern is a model for what business schools will increasingly do, which is to incorporate these kind of ideas into management training. I think management has actually gone a lot further in this regard than law, and so there's plenty of room for law to catch up. I think the tricky part is to get this information to people who exercise authority, because constantly I find that once people start using this approach, they like it. You know, I'll use the example of the ombudsperson in the Netherlands. The staff loved it because they were used to people coming in all day and yelling at them. And now people aren't yelling at them, people actually are nice to them. We find the same thing with the police. The police are like, this is great. People in the community are not throwing rocks at me all the time. They actually are willing to talk to me, they're friendly. And it's because they are approaching those people through this framework of, I'm going to treat you fairly, I'm going to listen to you, I'm going to explain my decisions, you're going to see that I'm trying to do the right thing in this situation. So I think the trick is that, to get it to people so that they can experience it, and then hopefully they can talk about it more.
We are not done with Professor Tyler, but we are going to take just a brief recess. And we're going to come back and we will have a panel. I can't call it an illustrious panel because I'm going to sit on it. We will have a panel of illustrious folks and me to continue giving us some food for thought in engaging with Tom's exciting work. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. I mean, go somewhere during the break, but then come back. Hello, everybody. You can make your choice. It makes sense. Well, I will start. Alrighty, Daddy, we're gonna reconvene. And I started so confidently and then just paused in silence. I do want to get straight to business because we are really lucky to have a great lineup. Look, I even have set it up properly now so that I can point to the great lineup, and I am over here. We've got a great lineup of panelists who reflect really in every way the exciting work that we're doing at DeMoore McKim and at the law school here at Northeastern. We have lawyers who have represented the largest, most systemically important businesses in the world in world-making transactions. We have leading scholars on race, gender, and identity in both the organizational context and in law. We have scholars of the relationships, both interpersonal and stakeholder relationships in the business context, stakeholder and interpersonal obligations in the business context. We have lawyers who make business accessible and available, not just to our C-suite power brokers, but to small and local and invested community members and community entrepreneurs. We include radicals and crits and institutionalists and proceduralists. We are trained in law, in psychology and economics, in education, in business and philosophy, in management, and we are all committed to understanding and advancing justice in the lives of the real people who work in and interact with business, which all of us can agree, for better or for worse, is really among the most important set of contemporary social institutions. What we're going to do is reflect briefly on the ways we directly, explicitly, implicitly engage, use, see the empirical work that Tom has done and the insights that flow from that empirical work in the very contexts of our own work. And with that, I will turn it over to you. I've given you lots of data, but you can always look us up on the internet if you want to continue to engage. Like Tom, you can reach out to me and I will send you many of their articles if they are not willing to do it themselves for a little bit of shyness. All right, with that, we'll turn it over to Marla.
Thank you. We were just discussing the order in which we're presenting, and I don't think that process was fair. So I just want to say, I understand procedural justice. And I first want to say that I feel like I've come full circle. I was just telling Tom Tyler this, because apparently I met him around the same time that you did, David, in the early 2000s in New York City. I was there during 9/11, and I was wanting to go back to school. I had my master's, but I wanted to get my PhD, and I wanted to do things to set myself apart because I know that the process is not always fair. Yeah, I will be sprinkling this throughout my talks today. I've been taking notes. And so I looked for a PhD student to work with just to get some experience doing research. And I went to NYU and emailed one of Tom's students, and we worked on creating an employee survey for my company. And Tom wrote me a letter of recommendation to get into Tulane. And now I'm sitting up here with him, so that's pretty awesome to me. And once again, I do see the value in procedural justice. I know that I get a lot of pushback at home if I ask one son to do something and he says, well, I did it first last time. His brother should do it first this time. But if we do rock, paper, scissors, that seems to work, right? Because that's pretty fair, it's pretty random. I really don't get any pushback when I do that. And so initially, I guess, for a while, justice has been sprinkled throughout, I guess, my life, my career as an academic. Starting a little bit before I even went to graduate school, I was working in a startup, and there were 3 rounds of layoffs, and I lasted after every single round. And I became really intrigued with interactional justice, which is the perceived fairness of how people are treated. And oftentimes the survivors, or the people who were let go, weren't treated the best way. And the survivors also weren't treated the best way. And so the morale dropped, job insecurity went up. I didn't feel that I was affected in that way because I had a relationship with the CEO, which for some of you, you might not think that was fair. I felt like it was fair at the time. So I never felt that my job was in jeopardy. But I became more focused on the employee dynamics more than the work. I was working in marketing at the time. And so I went back to school, and I went to Tulane thinking that I was going to focus on turnover and the survivors of layoffs, given my experience with my organization. And that turned out to be not too exciting. It's a little boring. And luckily, I was assigned to an advisor, Arthur Brief, who was this older white man, and he was doing diversity work. And I never thought about doing diversity work. And it was really interesting, and it was just eye-opening, all of the things that are going on in the workplace. And as an example, and this is what my dissertation was based on, Art was really wanting to understand, he was looking at gender diversity, and he really wanted to understand this idea that women in particular use their sexuality in a way to influence people in the workplace. He talked to a lot of women students, and they said, yeah, we do this all the time. We dress a certain way, we act a certain way, because we think that it helps, right? This is a way that we can sort of even the playing field because we don't have some of the same advantages as our male counterparts. And so Art was wondering, well, does this really work? The women think that it works, but does it really work? And so my first project with him was working on this study, and we interviewed a number of professional women, and we got a good sense of exactly how they use their sexuality in the workplace. And then we ran a couple of studies, and we found that it doesn't really work in terms of their compensation and the promotions that they receive. So they might think that it works, but it doesn't. And then I further explored this in my dissertation, and I found that even when you hold performance constant, women who use their sexuality are seen to be lower performers than women who don't, even when it's constant. And it's like, wow, look at this bias, which was just extremely interesting to me because in our society and in many societies, we encourage women to value their sexuality. And we say that this is what you bring to the table, this is your value. And then when women then think that they can use it for their benefit, it doesn't really work out in that way. And so in grad school, did a lot of work looking at fairness and looking at bias with gender. And every now and then I might sprinkle some things that came to mind after listening to Tom, and I think someone might have had a question about this. I don't know if it was Sonia or Sheila, but with procedural justice, one issue to me is, what if you don't think it's fair, right? And then is it subjective, where some people think that it's fair, but then other people think that it's unfair? And I'm thinking about what's going on with DE&I right now, right? And with college admissions now, you can't consider race in admissions, and some people think that's unfair, but other people thought that the process where you could consider race was fair. And so what happens? You know, is it really that objective? To me, it seems that it's subjective, which is why I think that transparency and trust, Tom brought up trust, I think that trust is really important. But I guess if you don't trust the people who are making these decisions, then you're likely not going to be happy with the outcomes. And so after my sexuality research, my colleagues and I did a number of studies where we were just trying to look at the different ways in which women in particular are treated in the workplace. We did some negotiation studies, and we found that women who are more agentic when they negotiate, meaning they're more assertive, they sort of take on the more stereotypical masculine traits, they're penalized when they negotiate for a male-typed position versus a female-type position. So we looked at women negotiating for a human resources position, women negotiating for a finance position, and the backlash occurred when they were negotiating for the finance position, and we assumed that people thought that they should just be happy to be in this arena where they are underrepresented, and they should not ask for more. They did not deserve to ask for more. I think the last thing I'll talk about is my work on tokenism, which I think is extremely interesting. And when I say tokenism, or a token, I mean people who are underrepresented numerically in a group, in an occupation, or an industry. And I think sometimes when you think of token, I had this conversation with my MBA class last night, I think sometimes we just assume that a token is always a person who represents something, right? They're there for window dressing or to show that the company is diverse. But Rosa Beth Kanter at Harvard said that anyone can be a token, and a token is just someone who is underrepresented numerically, right? So Kanter said that a woman in a group of 5 with 4 other men will have a very different experience than a woman in a group with maybe 2 other women, right? And the dynamics and her experiences are shaped by the number of women in the group. And it's difficult to be a token, as I've found in my latest paper on tokenism. When you're a token, it's easy to feel excluded and to feel isolated and to feel really visible. If you're a token woman or a token person of color, everybody knows when you're not in a meeting, right? Everybody knows when you're showing up late. And because of this heightened visibility, it's easy to feel a lot of pressure in how you perform, right? And so because you feel that everyone is watching you and you can't make a mistake as perhaps your counterparts can make a mistake. And we also found that it depends on the token. The outcomes and their experiences depend on the token, right? So initially when Kanter first discussed tokenism, she sort of just looked at women, right? So for a long time, we were always associating negative outcomes for being a token. But then more research said, well, let's look at what happens when men are tokens. Are they treated unfairly? Do they have some of the same negative experiences? And a lot of research shows that they don't, that it actually helps men to be tokens. And sometimes they enjoy the heightened visibility, right? And also there's something called the glass escalator, where men who are tokens tend to be fast-tracked to leadership positions in a way that you don't see women being fast-tracked to leadership positions in male-dominated organizations or industries. As of late, I've been taking on a more intersectionality approach in my research because there are lots of within-group differences. As an example, going back to tokenism, I love this study. I talk about it all the time. But researchers wanted to understand what is it like for men who are nurses, right? So men who are tokens in nursing. And they found that it really depends on the race of the nurse. And so they initially found that white male nurses were often misidentified as physicians, right? People just assumed that they were the doctor. But then black male nurses were misidentified as janitors or orderlies. So white man might walk into a room and they say, oh, doctor, And the male nurse says, oh, no, I'm the nurse, the doctor's on his way. But then if a black man walked in the room, they say, oh, can you empty this trash can for me? And so it's like, wow, this intersectionality is just really important. People's experiences really are shaped by their intersecting social identities. And so my colleagues and I now have been doing a lot of work on Black women executives, because they're often tokens at their levels, right? There are not a lot of women, there are not a lot of Black women, and oftentimes there are not a lot of Black men. So they're very unique. And so we have a number of studies where we're looking at some of the factors that have helped them get to these senior positions and some of the factors that have hurt them get to these positions, which, again, it's just been fascinating. And the last thing I'll say is we're looking at a study where we're looking at something called relational labor. I'm sure some of you have heard of emotional labor, which is sort of the effort and energy that it takes to display certain emotions, presumably because it's required for your job. You have to smile even when you don't want to smile. Where there's something also called relational labor, where this refers to the effort that it takes to maintain and sustain high quality relationships in the workplace, which are needed, right? Because you need people to get your work done. And we're looking at Black women in their relationships across difference, because for Black women, pretty much all of their relationships are across difference. And we're finding that after speaking with their peers, that their peers, white women, white men, and Black men, believe that it's the Black woman's responsibility to sort of carry the burden of managing these relationships. I think prior people thought that everyone should play a role in making sure that you have good relationships, but apparently in certain circumstances, some people believe that no, it's the Black woman's job to make sure that everyone is comfortable, that they trust her, that she can put people at ease versus others. So I can't wait to see what else we're going to find out. So in a nutshell, this is some of the work that I'm doing on or related to justice.
Hello. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I think I've been at Northeastern now 22 years, and I think this is the first joint business school, law school panel that I've attended, so hopefully it's the beginning of many more. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much, Tom, for a really interesting and I think compelling talk. My work, I started in the practice world and joined academia later. So I was an international business lawyer for 13 years and became an academic, although I've been doing kind of academic work all along. And part of what drew me into academia was a desire to try to bring the experience that I had as a business lawyer and having a sense of how business thought about law, about the complexity of law in a global context, with my sort of social justice and critical theory orientation, which I had before my practice. And so my work has sort of taken a different kind of conception of justice than the one we've been focusing on so far in terms of procedural justice. I've been more focused on distributional justice, not just economically, although that's been an important element, but also agency, inclusion, distribution of vulnerability, and power. And I've been looking at that on a global scale. And the way that I do that is by thinking about the corporation and its role in ordinary business activity as a sort of regulatory institution. So I think about the corporate law as a field, at least as it's sort of evolved since its beginnings in the early 20th century, has gotten, in my view, narrower and narrower. initially it was really focused on the relationship between firms and the relationship between the firm and the state. And now it's very much focused on the governance or relationships between managers and shareholders inside of a single firm. And so a lot of the sort of stuff that if you asked someone in an Uber or a cab, what is the impact of the corporation in society, it wouldn't come up in the corporate law class because the corporate law class is all focused on micro decision making inside of a single organization. So I'll talk about 3 different pieces of my work. I'm happy to elaborate on any of them or additional ones if people want to in the question and answers. So, but different ways that I've tried to go about this. So one of the ways was to, in my basic corporations law course, to do a couple of things. One is to, the sort of general ideology of the corporate law world is, even though that we've come to a certain kind of end of history moment, in that the modern corporation, for-profit corporation with certain kinds of attributes, has really achieved, is at the epitome of the organization of productive capitalism. It's the way to go. And so I try to problematize this by demonstrating the incredible diversity and relatively recent vintage of this idea of the corporation by thinking back to things as diverse as churches, universities, and hospitals, which were where corporations began, to the colonial corporation, to much of the infrastructure in the United States was built through public infrastructure corporations, which were actually public-private partnerships involved in building things like bridges or ferries or canals, to our contemporary moment where we still have an incredible diversity of nonprofits, cooperatives, municipal forms of corporation, but they don't come up at all in the field, in the conversation as relevant, even though they actually are very significant forms of organizing economic, social, and political life in our current contemporary society. They're not for-profit businesses. So that's one piece, is to sort of denaturalize the for-profit corporation as the only relevant thing about the form, and to raise the question, why is this form so plastic, so able to both be the vehicle through which someone organizes their self-employment with limited liability to the biggest institutions economically on the planet. And then the second piece is a big ideologically important element of the notion of corporate law as in its end of history mode and the for-profit world, is to imagine that the corporation is free for everybody. That essentially it's just, free incorporation was a liberating moment. It enabled everyone to, with initiative and desire and access to capital, to be able to engage in business, and then success or failure is really a result of their own skills or the quality of their ideas or whatever. So another thing I do in my basic corporations class is problematize that by situating 2 different hypothetical business startups. One is a business that's being created by 2 women of color, an African-American woman who went to business school and a Latinx woman who went to law school, and they're trying to start a small business in the inner city, and a group of people who are trying to acquire a manufacturing business. The race isn't clear, but it's sort of pretextually imagined that they're probably white. And when you situate their evolution through the various stages of business development. What form should they use? How should they imagine their capital structure? How should they design? You suddenly realize that actually at every single stage of the game, if you look at sociological literature in the post-civil rights, fair housing, voting rights period, you see that in every way, from getting a lease to getting financing to getting a loan to getting insurance to being able to get equipment, it's much, much harder for one group than the other. So the fact that you could, even though the stakes of the business are smaller, so one of the things you can start to see is free incorporation is only the beginning of the story. It's situated in a deep and complex social context, and it brings a lot of the kinds of things that you're working on, Marla, into the story. And then I bring those things all the way through the course to the end, where I focus on corporate accountability structures in a range of different ways. And so a second piece of my work is thinking about the international business, or business as a regulatory institution. And the way I started looking at that was, just to give you a terribly crude example, we can see that businesses formed in developed countries, or in big democratic capitalist countries, Europe or the United States, maybe maybe Japan, have a disproportionate impact on the places where they invest, in part because their investment is desirable, foreign investment is scarce, and so what I try to do is think about not are they influencing the state in the place where they go, but how are their business decisions impacting the economic, social, and life of the place where they're doing their business. And so just to give you a very crude example, you could imagine that if the Delaware corporate law had, death penalty for grossly negligent managers who engaged in grossly negligent decisions that had an adverse impact on health or environment, there'd be radically different decisions on a global scale instantly. And so it's a way of trying to show the way in which certain kinds of corporate rules are transnationalized through business decision-making and business processes that have nothing to do with the extraterritorial desires of Delaware, but just the ways in which the global economy is organized, and how those impacts suddenly suggest new ways of thinking about reimagining global justice through focusing on business law in a different way. A third thing that has been really on my mind that kind of links up a couple of the things I work basically mainly on corporate power and its impact in developing contexts. But recently I've been really focused on the parts of the basically majority of the developing world which hasn't seen the kinds of benefits of globalization that came about in the Asian tigers and a couple of other places. And really tried to think about sort of cutting edge ideas right now about what they should do is get into global supply chains, figure out how to stay in them, innovate, try to capture through intellectual property or other means a larger piece of the value that is distributed in the global chains. And what I've been trying to think about is sort of reorienting development thinking from getting into the global economy where we have, partly because of the success of developmentalism, surplus manufacturing capacity at the low end, intense competition. It's almost impossible to get any significant rents out of the production process if you're making T-shirts, and upgrading is not going to work. Then the question is, what can you do? And so part of what I've started to think about is ways of reimagining the development context by, instead of focusing outward, focusing more on some of the values that Tom was thinking about. What do we need? How do we include people? How do we ensure that people are cared for? How do we manage our consumption? How do we, right? And then try to think about what kinds of institutional forms would be possible for experimentation in these realms. And this brings us back to the idea of thinking about the corporation and its plasticity as a potential organizing tool for collective social, economic, and political governance that wouldn't have to be organized around profit, but could be organized around community well-being. Because in this context, we have two situations, right? One, we have to be able to interface. So if these communities are trying to do something different and the rest of the world is not doing what they're doing, then there needs to be a mechanism for interacting between, and that means you need some sort of legal personality. And then secondly, people can't make everything they need. So there needs to be mechanisms for sharing and interacting. And so this is a different kind of imaginary of global value chains. It's value chains of interdependence in which different kinds of social experiments could connect with each other through common values, right? Not necessarily universal values, more plural values, but they could see that even if we don't share all our values, there are elements in which we need each other. Our interdependence is actually mutually beneficial, and we could somehow help each other to survive whatever we're looking at, whether it's climate crisis or pandemics or geopolitical strife, more resiliently. And so that requires a whole new way of thinking about law and business. And I'm doing a visit to an institute called the New Institute in Hamburg to work on with a colleague who's German on the idea of the law of the commons. And essentially it's trying to imagine across property, across contract, across corporation, of course, how might we begin to think about the institutional forms that are going to be needed to facilitate the kinds of self-generated governance that we're going to need to manage our collective and individual futures. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Is there something special that we need to do to be able to see this?
The slides?
It's very dramatic.
All me. You saw it. You saw it first here.
All right. Thanks for having me. So I was being told the junior need to do much more, so that's why I have slides, right? Anyhow, I'm a researcher, specifically in business school. I study behaviors in an organization context. And so most of my work is kind of built upon Tom's work, actually. As a student, when I, decade ago, I was so fascinated by Tom's work on how justice matters in organization. And so most of us, or actually all of us, because our education, because our life experiences, we tend to approach justice using a very moral foundation perspective. We perceive justice as a dignity. We perceive justice as a very fundamental moral rights or human rights in any ways. But today, I'm gonna take a little bit spin to talk about how justice matters to organizations and how does that really can help organizations to produce or generate concrete economic benefits. So I hate myself linking those fundamental sacred value with economic benefits, but I'm a researcher in a business school, so that's what we do, right? So back to the beginning of our today's morning session, I want to pull back this picture back again. This is exactly what our dean said at the beginning. That's Tom Taylor's work, right? So you can see in this NYPD car's slogan, there's two specifically words talk about the courtesy and respect. Those are the core elements of procedural justice and also the overall perception of justice. And people, a lot of tons of studies shared by Tom, we find that actually when people are more engaged in this whole process, and they are more likely to be part of the community, so they genuinely will respect the order and will comply with those norms, rules, and also the overall policies overall. So, however, in real world, we still see a lot of great performance, particularly. They are always a great norm breakers. So we see a lot of people like they are genius, but at the same time, they are also the rule breakers in the organization context. For those individual performance, so specifically in the Netflix culture, one of them, the CEO here, Reed Hastings, was saying that they have zero tolerance of what we call as a brilliant jerks, who is actually great individual performance. But at the same time, they defy the rules, they go against the norms, they engage in this gray zone and have lots of shady characters. And so people try to make sense of those people and try to understand why we have those people. And normally we tend to be perceptional, we tend to be automatic because we tend to categorize those people from the personality traits, and we tend to process or understand people from the two very fundamental dimensions. One is our competence, the other is our worms. So we have those brilliant, what we call as a brilliant jerks, which is also we tend to perceive as competent, but at the same time, we don't want to interact with them. But at the same time, we over have those level stuff. So my question today, I was trying to ask is that whether this is just because the person itself or there's actually, what if this is a problem for our managerial practice? What if this is actually a failure of our managerial system? Instead of getting rid of those competent jerks, what our management system can do to help transform those brilliant geniuses into the good citizens? And that actually can boil down to our today's topic on justice, because that's exactly how our justice can do. So lots of work in this area, we tend to understand why justice and how justice matter in the organization from the two different perspectives. The most dominant one is actually Tom's work on social identity. So we talk about like when people treated fairly, particularly through the whole process, people tend to build those kind of attach themselves with the organization, with the value of the organization, with the belief of organizations, and also with the mission of the organization. But at the same time, there's also a completely different aspect, what we call as a social exchange. So the social exchange talk about that people tend to be, mental accounting what they receive from the organization or from our friends or from our boss. In a way, they tend to try to reciprocate the equivalent resources or support. And those resources can be tangible or can be intangible. So the justice, enactment from the authority, from the decision maker, oftentimes indeed can help engender a lot of resources for those employee members, because they feel like they've been recognized, they feel like they've been fairly rewarded, and they develop this sense of exchange. So it is very powerful, because that actually you can generate immediate responses from employee members, and they tend to produce high performance, and they bring a lot of benefits to the organization. And they try to understand, they try to do a lot. But at the same time, we observe in our numerous examples, those people oftentimes, they are also the norm breakers. They tend to, try to get their own benefits in a way to sacrifice or other people's best interests, or sometimes even break the norm or the rules of the organization. So what I'm trying to understand here now was the two differences between these two dominant frameworks in accounting for the justice effects. So in one of my studies, I'm trying to understand and build upon the numerous studies that has been conducted before, published before. So in the one particular meta-analysis study, which actually briefly mentioned by Tom before, so we try to understand how the two different aspects will actually affect the behavior outcomes, which is the employee members' performance overall. So we found actually social exchange quality, specifically when we feel like the justice can give us something resources. Yes, that's very immediate outcome, is that the people can produce much more in their individual performance, so they can bring a lot of benefits to the organization. But what surprised me a lot is actually the social exchange quality doesn't really help us adjust that people are less likely to engage those what we call as a counterproductive behavior, which is they are more likely to engage in those misconduct, and norm violation has zero effects. Instead, when we consider that, like justice can do really help us to reinforce our sense of group identification, which link to much more better citizens among employee members. They engage in the community more. They do much more helping behavioral. They are trying to engage a lot of actual real work to facilitate the functioning of the entire firm and the community. And more importantly, they are much, much less likely to violate the norm and trying to benefit themselves in a way that might hurt the system, might hurt other people. So now the question is that you might ask why people have these two sense of interpretation or sense of making process when we experience the justice. This is the nuances that we are touching now. Because when we feel or when we experience the justice, people tend to make sense of the justice in two different ways. The first one is that people tend to perceive whether my authority or decision maker is really genuinely appreciate my value or genuinely appreciate me as an individual person in this community. The other one is kind of more like what Marla was suggesting is a tokenism, is that, it's just their obliged responsibility. People can tell the nuance, the differences over here, which actually will have a downstream effects about how people will interpret and also the effects of justice. And this kind of brings back to my final points about the broader implication for what's in our current society, what's going on for the DEI policies, right? So we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there's one study I'm kind of running right now, is that actually sometimes when we talk about inclusion itself, it's actually already subtly treating and priming people's sense of status and privilege difference. Because why we need inclusion if every group member is equally recognized in the room? Why we need inclusion if all the group members are equally being placed based upon their units, based upon their differences? So the inclusion itself have this fallacy or illusion about triggering a justice or status difference. And so in one of my studies, I trying to understand and I ask people give them all these DI statements from the SP 500 firms. And clearly, so when the people read those highly based upon inclusion arguments, people tend to perceive that those firms tend to counterpose the dominant group and those marginalized groups. And they actually, this kind of process or this kind of message will fully continue to reproduce and reinforce the perceptions of privilege and recognition. So this kind of go back to the very beginning that why we need justice is actually we genuinely appreciate the people's value and from all the population in our society. So maybe, to close that, instead of saying diversity, inclusion, or equality, or maybe we can say diversity, equity, and appreciation. So that's what I would like to share.
This is also all me.
Well, while I'm doing this, let me just thank Professor Tyler, the deans, and my co-panelists. It's really quite an honor and pleasure to be here. And as usual, technology matters. I think I got it. Okay, very good. So I want to tell you about my research and an old way of thinking about justice that's driven my agenda from the start of my PhD program. I'd like to persuade you that meditating on the meaning of Empirical as used by Aristotle shows us how important each of us is to this collective project of living together successfully and justly, using systems of law and money as tools to advance our project. And then I'm going to tell you how this grounds my inquiry into the quality of intersections, where we actually transact with each other and may achieve the fruits of cooperation. And then I'm going to focus in particular on the quality of purpose, what we bring to these intersections. And as you'll see, one of my concerns is that as academics, I think we really have to focus on challenging prevailing ideas out there in the public and in the academy that cast illegitimacy on this concept of decency. So let me start by telling you how Aristotle conceptualized epieikeia. I was at the right place at the right time, 2003, taking a seminar on Aristotle's ethics. At the end of the seminar on Book 5 on justice, the professor turned from distributive and corrective justice, the most common topics looked at, and switched to this short 700-word chapter, 10 on epieikeia. And epieikeia is translated as equity, usually, fairness, and I'm going to focus on thinking about it as decency, as the decency we bring to how we engage with rules of law. Aristotle begins the conversation with a puzzle. Sometimes we praise what is decent, and that more decent is better. But that seems kind of absurd because
how can it be better than justice? So either the just is not excellent or what is decent is not excellent. So are these the same thing or are they different? To understand that, we need to understand why epikeia matters at all, and the issue is the structure and nature of law itself. So if you can picture a domain of law as a craggy and unpredictable surface, the reality is that legislation is like a straight edge. It necessarily is going to miss some of the nuance and what we just can't anticipate. So all law is universal, but in some areas, the universal rule cannot be correct. So we go with the universal rule knowing that there's going to be an error made. The law is no less correct on this account. It's not a fault of the legislators, and it's not a fault of the legislation. It's the nature of the object. So if you consider a very uncertain area, perhaps regulation of social media might be one of those, sometimes the universal rule is just not going to fit the facts. And then Aristotle says it is correct to rectify the deficiency with your own choice and action. The model that he suggests is to think what the legislators would have done if they had been there to witness this gap between the general rule and the reality of life. And Aristotle then says, so what is decent is just. It's better than a certain way of being just, not better than what is unconditionally just, but better than the error that you'd make if you just took the rule to be it. And this is the nature of what is decent, rectification of the law insofar as the universality of law makes it deficient. It's clear from this what is decent, clear that it is just and better than a certain kind of way of being just. It's also evident who the decent person is. This chapter is addressed to each of us who actually care to be just ourselves. They are the ones who decide for and does such actions, not an exact stickler for justice in the bad way, but taking less than they might, even though they have the law on their side. And so what I think we need to see is that on one hand, Aristotle is telling us about the limits of law, what we can't expect law to give us. On the other hand, he's telling us what we need to bring to the law, that we need to be willing to take less than our legal entitlements. So in this division of labor between systems of law and other social norms, and each of us who's actually choosing how we act, we need play in the joints. Legislation creates play in the joints by its structure, and we need to be there to provide, in a sense, the last mile on the delivery of legal justice. So I went off to law school to clerk in the federal courts, practice as a litigator, and as a deal lawyer on Wall Street. I saw a lot of sticklers. And I saw that the institutions and norms of legal practice were not really infused with decency. So after 6 years, I decided to pursue a PhD in business, writing in my application essay that my research project aims to illuminate the dynamics of equitable behavior, decency, as a function of factors, legal and otherwise, defining an actor's organizational context, that decisional space in which one can look to act beyond the letter of the law. Right away, I found two footholds for my inquiry into epikeia. I discovered Oliver Williamson's transaction cost economics and his contention that the primary vulnerability of what he calls hybrid governance, the bespoke deals I'd worked on as an attorney, is the literal enforcement that characterizes our contract law and which produces so much injustice when there is a change of circumstances that people didn't plan for and one party leans on the letter of their contract. The institutional question is, what can we do to better design contract law to avoid some of this injustice and make cooperation more attractive? Williamson assumes that the only lever in the legal toolkit is to calibrate excuse doctrine. In my dissertation, I argue that there's actually an alternative to literal enforcement. It's in some precedents in the courts of equity in other cases. In any case, it's been forgotten. I can talk about that in the Q&A. In my own behavioral study with a colleague, we provided some classic cases as vignettes to try to understand how contractors responded to changes in circumstances. Perhaps not surprisingly, we found that far and away the key factor that emerged as a predictor of the intention to act with lawful opportunism was a strong sense of entitlement. So I can't go into this any further now, but I want to share another gift that I got from Williamson, and that was pointing me to legal scholar Lon Fuller's conception of eunomics as the science, theory, or study of good order and workable arrangements. The name comes from the Greek goddess of good governance, Eunomia, and the picture that we get is of a study of the quality of the intersections, the gears that translate human intention and action into cooperation, and they can work well or they can fall apart. And when we reflect on a lot of the corporate actions that have caught the news in the last 20 years, we know that we've got some issues, that there's something off, if not with the intersections, then with the purpose that these corporations are bringing to them. I got to Wharton in 2009, and Milton Friedman's doctrine of shareholder primacy was everywhere, basically taken for granted in every department except my own, legal studies and business ethics. And if you read his 1970 article, as I'm forced to do hundreds of times per year, you see that Friedman is saying that it is immoral for managers to act with decency. If you want to spend more on the environment that the law requires, you are stealing from your shareholders. And that is stigmatized, and if you bring your personal values to your work, you're taking us down the road to communism. Friedman's picture of managers as employees of shareholders was turned into an academic way of approaching research by Michael Jensen, and I found that these assumptions pervaded business school research. Including in my corporate strategy seminar, which the syllabus says explores current research articles that best represent the development of rent-generating resources at the level of the firm. Fortunately, I got my second foothold into Epieikeia when I discovered Kenneth Andrews, known for his 1965 casebook on business policy, a subject that is now known as strategy or strategic management. I found the book in the library, I jumped to the chapter on social responsibility, and there I found Andrews attacking Friedman directly, calling out by name Friedman and his dowdy band of economic isolationists who argue that business should be required only to live up to its legal obligations, and that consideration of strategic alternatives should be exclusively economic. I dug in further, and I see Andrews responding to Friedman and the economic isolationists exactly as Aristotle would have. Government regulation, certainly essential for the provision of ground rules for competition and the prohibition of grossly improper and dishonest behavior, is neither a subtle instrument for reconciling private and public interests, nor an effective substitute for knowledgeable self-restraint. Managers themselves have the best information. They are in the position to recognize the limitations of existing law and bring corporate strategy to hew to the principles of joint cooperation. According to Andrews and the whole approach that his school developed, the top management's job is to contribute quality to purpose through standards, exercise in the choice of what to do and the way in which it is to be done. Conscious attention to corporate strategy will be wasted, Andrews says, if it does not elevate the quality of corporate purpose and achievement. I was a PhD student when Michael Porter, Andrews' most famous student, wrote his paper, Creating Shared Value. It's a big deal for Porter to be addressing social and environmental issues, but he doesn't call for decency or social responsibility. He says we should look for win-wins, ways that we can make money and address social and environmental issues, and I agree that that is extremely important, but it's not enough. It's not enough for the same reasons that Aristotle and Andrews tell us, because business is full of regulatory voids where existing law and business practice simply doesn't address the issues at hand. That's what the fashion brands found when the Rana Plaza building collapsed in 2013, killing over 1,000 workers, one of the worst industrial accidents out there. And so I wrote with co-authors this article, Beyond the Win-Win, and we simply outline a framework for how you can remember to bring decency to corporate strategy by identifying whether existing norms are legitimate or not, and if they aren't, either you go find them somewhere else or you make them yourselves, and that's what every brand, major brand in the United States and Europe did immediately after the Rana Plaza crash. In my research, I've extended this approach to look at corporate innovation for environmental sustainability, address the foundations of human rights norms, how companies can avoid perpetuating environmental racism through their corporate compliance programs that are too focused on financial returns and risk management, how companies like Uber and the other big tech firms that are around the world trying to change law to fit their business models can actually engage in that project responsibly with procedural justice in trying to influence the legal norms that they are subject to. And I've also looked at the question of beneficence. When is it legitimate and why for managers to actually bring their own commitment to promote the well-being of others to corporate action that responds to the most serious issues before us, like Moderna and Pfizer? Are they going to, or are they not going to share their patents for life-saving drugs? We found out that they said no. The model here that captures my argument is quite similar to former Best Buy CEO Hubert Joly's Venn diagram for thinking about your own company's purpose. With the last couple of minutes of my remarks here, I want to tell you about some current work. Last year, there was a special issue in a leading strategy journal, Strategy Science, all about the question of corporate purpose. Our own Ruth Aguilera published in this volume. And my concern with this research is that many management scholars do not recognize the role that they have in taking positions on what's good and what companies should do. The red papers in particular come through a program called New Stakeholder the New Stakeholder Management literature, and they reject the idea that morality has any role in their research. They understand that they're trying to understand purpose as an instrument of economic value. And I guess I have two concerns with this approach. Main one is I don't think we're going to see the whole picture. If we think about purpose that is valuable only because it causes certain perceptions in stakeholders, yes, signals are important. We need to be strategic about communication, but the message itself matters, and we need to be able to evaluate the message itself. Another scholar, also from Wharton, Claudine Gertenberg, she looks to employees to understand the strength of corporate purpose, and I think this makes a lot of sense. Corporate purpose can course through the people of an organization, or it might not, and it's powerful when it does, like a stream of water. But I think we also need to ask about the quality of that strong purpose, and that's something that this research is not doing. I think we need to both think about the strength of purpose and whether it's beneficial or harmful, just like we do with water. So in sum, my critical comment to management researchers, and I guess legal scholars as well, is to avoid theories that value purpose only instrumentally and search for empirical methods that elucidate the quality and the life of corporate purpose. To conclude, I think it really matters what assumptions we make in our research and thus our teaching. And I think we should do everything we can to recognize the legitimacy of decency in business and challenge and undermine ideas that get in the way to promote the quality of purpose and the quality of our intersections where we transact and cooperate. Thank you.
Hello. All right. Awesome. Thank you for this opportunity. It's an honor to sit with these panelists and to be engaged in this conversation. My name is Daryl Walton, and I am the associate clinical professor and the director of the law school's community business clinic. So I am, in some ways, an academic, in some ways, very much still in practice. For those of you who don't know, the community business clinic is an experiential education opportunity for law students to engage in actual practice of law while still in law school. And so each semester, 8 students work in teams underneath my supervision as a supervising attorney to actually represent live clients. And so I think my point of view comes from both my role in that sense on justice, and my engagements there, but then also it comes from where my personal journey came from. So before law school, I was a small business owner. I was a solo. I had started an LLC, but I was on my own. And the ideas of how do I navigate as a business owner were challenging. and they were challenging, and it's impressive considering that, I consider myself a semi-intelligent individual, right? Society tells me I'm smart. I went to MIT, I'm sitting on this panel, but like I struggled navigating the hurdles, right? And I find myself asking the question, if I were struggling, how many other people are also struggling? And so the work that comes from these experiences really centers around this idea of looking at the individual and at the micro level, right? So we're representing clients, and our target area is the neighborhoods just south of campus, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, for a variety of reasons, which I can go into later. But really, it's this idea of, I think we've talked a lot about top-down instilling of justice, or how do we make it work from top down? And I would almost argue that it can't come top down. Because to answer Marla's question, it is subjective, right? Each person views justice differently. And so what is justice for one of my clients is not necessarily justice for another. And it doesn't match any of the definitions for justice that have probably been given today. And so I think it's important that we start with that context. And when I'm working through this, what I'll say is, when I hear justice, right, so my role as a practitioner and as a teacher is to hear what the people I'm interacting with say. And so what I hear from my clients about justice is pretty much three things. One, they want respect. Two, they want access. And three, they want to be seen. And the way that, this comes into play, to give you kind of some legit, tangible actions, is we represent clients who want to form LLCs here in Massachusetts. And to form an LLC in Massachusetts, you have to file with the state in order to gain limited liability protection, so that coveted protection to minimize your risk. But in order to file, you need to pay $500 to the state. And $500 to many, when I've raised this question about, is it fair to have to pay $500, many say, well, it's just the cost of doing business. Or others say, well, how much does it cost in other states? And the answer to both, or to the latter, is it costs a lot less in every other state in this country than it does here in Massachusetts. Over a 5-year period, it's about double here in Massachusetts than it costs in any other state. But where does that come into play for my clinic? It comes into play when my students who are social justice minded are representing a client who says, hey, I want to start a business, and they say, cool, we'll help you. They go through all the work to form, and then they try to explain what the fee is, and what they see in the client's eyes when they say $500 is the client shrink. They see the client feel like, oh my gosh, it's such a large amount of money, or their business just isn't viable, right? Because what their business is they're trying to make a generational change by making $2,000 a year difference, because that's going to impact their family. But because we view business not in that lens, we tend not to think about, about it that way. And so respect is actually seeing people from where they're coming from, and it's also part of being seen. But I think access is the key piece to which we can focus on, both from the business school and from the law school standpoint, is how do we actually make real change by, after we see from these individuals what's happening, how do we actually do something about it? And so how do we identify, is it lowering LLC fees on the front end, or is it the fact that there's an annual maintenance fee as well? But also, what are we doing to challenge the perceived fairness in systems that we have? For example, when we talk about procedural fairness, we tend to think of our legislative body as a body that deliberates, a body that comes from the people, represents the people, and comes to decisions. But in the example I just gave about LLC fees, I would say there's a lot of people who would say that the procedure of coming up with that amount wasn't fair, whether it was the outcome, because they would say that they're not represented, or that the fact that that fee came into place in 1994, and it's now 2024, so here we are 30 years later, why haven't we had a serious conversation about updating that or thinking about it? Or was it fair that that fee largely came into consideration because at the time that they installed LLCs, before that we had, organizations we had partnerships for people who were professionals, and professionals were paying $500 a fee. So is it fair procedurally that people who are starting small businesses are paying the same as people who are professionals who we expect to make more money? And so I think I have more questions than answers, but my solution for this one is we need to revisit what we think of as fair processes, right? And we need to challenge what our understanding of procedural fairness is, or what procedural justice is, because what we perceive from our positions of privilege are not the actual, aren't necessarily in line with what other people and those at the end of the spectrum feel, right? And so above my desk, I actually have a quote, and it says, "Even just hands must be mindful when holding the tools of the master or power." And what I want to get at is this idea that we may have the best intentions, and we may think that what we're doing is just, but when we have, power, right, we tend to lean things in the way that we want them and not necessarily the way that, that they might, ought, or should go, or serve everyone else. And so I would just caution us in that regard to kind of pull back and be thoughtful about what we're saying when we're thinking about what can we do, what is our role. Because I think first our role is to listen, make sure we understand everything, take it all in, and go from there. I'll leave it there for time purposes, but I look forward to questions.
So I look and I read and I listen to Tom's work, and I hear that justice makes our institutions better, right? Justice makes it so our economic engines, whether we want them to be those or not, in the context of business, makes them work better, right? If it's just inside your organization, then people will come to work and not just do work. They will go above and beyond. We sit in a university setting and know that the university really relies heavily on me going above and beyond without compensation to make the institution as vibrant as it is. And from that comes amazing innovation, and from that comes societies and communities that function well. And then I listened to my colleagues today, and I'm like, this is a super cool university. We're awesome. And Marla reminded us that inside these institutions, not everybody is living the same life. And that as we implement this, we really need to think and see and recognize how even within one institution, people are playing different roles, and that has different meanings. And so what these processes of justice will look like are not a heuristic. It's not a model, right? It's not a single model. It's models that need to be considered. And Jianyu's work takes us there even deeper, right? Think about how people are able to engage around justice and identify even how we're talking about, even how we're presenting concepts of the institutions being just, right? And Dan reminds us that as fair and wonderful and beautiful as institutions might be, if we're not intimately involved in broader notions of justice, specifically distributional justice, specifically thinking about society's positions and how we use these powerful organizations, then we haven't gotten very far to the core concepts of justice, even if we feel good about them. And Gaston says, but hold up, I just don't want to feel good about them. I just don't want distributional justice. I want business to just do good. And I want to think about how we can leverage core legal systems to make them do good as they feel good, as they're being responsive to all people's positions. And Daryl says, hold up. We sit in our proverbial ivory tower and can do none of these lofty goals if we don't listen to the individuals inside organizations and don't recognize and give agency to the idea that people name their justice. And their justice might not be my justice. And this all really is important to me because in my own work, I think about how institutions make people, how law makes people, how we position and understand ourselves, right? Based on the way we pursue property, based on the way based on how we get jobs, based on the things we have, our access and power and authority over material resources. So as we're using institutions and creating institutions, we are creating ourselves and we are creating society. And so this is really important work for me not because business are the major economic drivers and that we have seeded that space in some real way, but because what we're doing in our organizations is making us. And how we're responding to law is making us and is helping us and forcing us to understand. And Tom, I really appreciate how your work actually reflects. I understand me ontologically, epistemologically, vocationally through this. And so it is important that these institutions are functioning right. They're doing good. They're listening to me. They're paying attention to our different jobs, and they are serving these broader distributional justice aims. And with that, I want the conversation to continue. I'm gonna take a little bit of license. Rather than do a traditional open Q&A, panelists, you're just gonna have to go with me here. We're gonna go out into the audience and we're gonna continue our conversations now because we're making ourselves in this space. We're making ourselves and we're making our communities, and we are collaborating as a business school and a law school, and this is the beginning of a beautiful relationship that we are putting in action, and we need to thank Tom Tyler for making that a reality for us. So as our panelists go into the audience, can we give another round of applause to them and to Tom for really beginning a new era of collaboration. Thank you guys so much. That was real. That was real. Go into the audience for real. We're going to chat. We're having a conversation together. Yes.